Valerie Kochman. Welcome to my show. Today we are discussing about vaccine controversy. I'm having Jordan Henderson joining me in the studio. He did immense work around medical freedom, let's just say like this. And Jordan, do you mind if I address you informally?
Not at all.
Okay, would you tell us more about yourself and your work?
Yes, absolutely. I began doing some social and political paintings during COVID. I'd done none before that, and it just was an interesting topic. So I'll just go ahead and show you a couple, if you don't mind my sharing the screen here. Let me see how I can do that.
But I think a lot of people, like famous intellectuals, didn't even do anything when it was Corona. So I don't think it's like a bad thing that you didn't do anything sooner.
Yes, a lot of people did take a long time to come about on anything. I had already been familiar with the controversy around vaccines to some degree because I'd read several books on it, beginning with Dissolving Illusions, and then a couple from some heretical authors in Spain. So I had a bit of a head start. So it wasn't really, at no point did it seem like COVID was a very believable story to me.
Yeah, my point here was that you at least did something, which was actually a lot. And many people from whom we expect to be like vocal opposers of dictatorship rule were just quiet.
Yes, they were. Yeah, that was quite a shock for sure. And I imagine the situation was the same in Slovenia, that you didn't have many public intellectuals opposing it, at least not early on.
Not at all. Those who are like recognizable or mainstream media supported activists or intellectuals did just the opposite. They attacked every critical voice.
Yeah, that was very similar here, early on anyways.
Did you manage to share
move
screen?
the screen? No, for some reason I'm now having a little more difficulty with it. Let's see if I...
Here they are.
So you see it on your side?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, perfect. So want me to go ahead and go over a couple of these now?
Yeah, please.
Okay, sure. So here's an example, right, of one of the types of paintings I was doing. Here, let me go ahead and open that a little larger of a size. Right, so just kind of a symbolic painting with a parent and child pushing back against the new normal. Vaccines and lockdowns symbolized by handcuffs, the CDC building in the background.
So, can you repeat this part again? Because I accidentally removed you from the screen and close your mic.
Oh no, that's all right. That's no problem. Here, let me go ahead and do that. All right, so I'll just show you a few examples of what I was painting. A lot of these really kind of speak for themselves, so I'll just sift through on the slideshow setting here. This was the earliest one I painted, called Sanity, Her Son, and the Credulous. This one, the symbolism gets pretty heavy there, so I'll just let viewers revisit that later if they like. Here it's a little more obvious what's going on, right? You know, it's satirical, a bit of dark humor, called Safe and Sanitized. The handcuffs representing lockdowns, a mask for the mask mandates, and then a skull because, you know, obviously it's not in people's best interest to go along with that.
I should say that these paintings of yours, they're so powerful. We should have them like in museum.
That would be fine with me.
Anti-corona. Maybe not original paintings, but some replicas, so that it would be like...
It would be nice to get them out more. I've got them out a little. Like I was able to show them at a gallery in Colorado here and had them up for some time there. So that was nice during COVID, being able to actually get them out to the public to view.
Yeah, remember each time that you sent a painting to me from this Corona painting series, I was always shocked after the Sanity, Her Son, and Credulous. But it was so, we should go back to that time. Everything was like passive, people were frightened, and it was really rebellious to speak against the authorities. I think that nowadays we mostly forgot about that. And
yeah, that's true, because the tide has changed so much that now it's almost kind of like the cool thing to speak out against that. But it took a really long time. It took, probably about a year before there was actually kind of what you might call like a mainstream move against it. And here in the States, everyone thinks that the Republicans were really strongly against it, but they weren't for a long time. It took them about a year to finally start pushing back hard.
Yeah, and they kind of forgot main voices against this tyranny. I think, at least in Slovenia, now we have this guy who wasn't even the leader of the protest, like his mainstream media's person characterized as a leader of the protests. Actually, really funny.
That is, yeah. I think something similar happened here, right? That some of the big names, what's a word for it? I've heard an analogy of getting in front of a parade and pretending that you're leading it.
Yeah,
Which I
control
think
to
applies.
position.
Yeah, this is a
This is from
cover.
the book, right?
Yeah, I did for John Manley for his book. This was a little as far as, there's a lot going on in this one, but it was especially that Christians put up so little resistance, right? Even having their churches closed. And again, eventually they came around, which I'll have to give them credit for. But at first they just went along with everything. So I was a little frustrated with them, and I think you can see some of the frustration in that painting.
But
This was
here is about leftists.
yes.
About both parties actually show their real faces.
Yeah. So this was the Ottawa Freedom, the trucker convoy, and just symbolizing some of the absurdity of the left thinking they were fighting Nazis, and just put in a couple of the most extreme examples of obviously not Nazis or even close to the stereotype, like some of the Sikhs who attended and some of the indigenous people who attended as well, even though they were a minority. And this is the last one I've painted on kind of the COVID theme. And here I feel pretty good about getting into a little more of the humor on it. A lot of people don't notice the shadow the first time they see it, as far as like a monster approaching this doctor and him holding up a vaccine, kind of like how you would hold up a cross to.
Sacred amulet.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So that gives people a little idea of the paintings that I was doing. And these were all done during COVID. And then after COVID, I wanted to go in and look at basically why people had been so susceptible. So again, I think a lot of us who hadn't been susceptible had already been familiar with controversies on medical themes, on maybe like AIDS or other vaccines. I imagine you were in the same boat, that you probably already knew quite a bit on some of these matters. Is that the case?
Yeah, I knew. I almost expected some big cataclysm at the time, because it was clear that economical situation and all the diversity in a bad way, because it's obviously good to have some diversities. But actually, as a child, I read a lot of also criminal books, also medical criminal books. So I always had this resentment. But during the high school, I'm not really proud to admit, but I was more or less ignorant. During the study, I started to really research every details. I checked what's behind every stone, what's in every book, and even I went further from professors' teachings. And I wasn't surprised when this started. And maybe I had some in the first 2 weeks. I was a bit, okay, let's see what is going to be. I'm always a bit naive when something starts, but after that period, I of course I jumped into the boat, and on the right side, and the right side, not the right political side, but on the right side. Yes.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah. Yeah, so my experience was similar, right? And so during COVID, painting was the main way that I had of kind of speaking out against it, as well as having some fun exploring it, because it was really interesting seeing all of that happen. So afterwards, I thought, okay, why were people so susceptible to begin with? And why did some of us, basically know better early on? And so I thought, okay, well, because people have all this mythology already around medicine, right? And one of the biggest ones, there's tons of areas where people believe things around medicine that we could say are false, right? But one of the biggest ones that upholds the reputation of modern medicine more than almost anything else, not that it's all bad, but as far as basically a belief system rather than something based in reality, is that vaccines are the main reason we no longer have these horrible levels of infant mortality and death in general from infectious disease, right? So that's a widely promoted belief, and it really gives people a faith in vaccines as a savior that they shouldn't have if they knew the full story. So I thought, okay, well, I'll go ahead and investigate that. And that's where this series that I came up with called Vaccine Evangelists, Apostates, and Apologists came about, was analyzing why people believed that and the whole controversy around it. And that was immediately after COVID that I started work on that series.
Yeah, like I said, to refrain to that point of view that not all medicine is bad. I don't like, in particular, their like enforcing, and I think it was even more in the countries of ex-Yugoslavia or different parts of non-Western world than in the Western world. In some point of view, we were not so surprised here in general because medical staff was always, yes, you have to do this, and almost like enforcement kind of way from way back. And I think this is something new for the Western, for the other Western world, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, something similar happened maybe with smallpox as far as something really similar to COVID, but that's so long ago, it's almost completely out, or maybe even the Spanish flu too, as far as the enforcement and the social enforcement and making everyone go along with it. So I think we've had a couple things like that, but it's been about a century by the time it happened again, and almost everyone had forgotten that or had no experience of it.
Okay, so now we're getting to the essays.
So just to go back to something you were saying on medicine, like you say, it's not all bad, right? And I think that's why they can get so much belief in it to begin with, because especially something, medicine is incredible, modern medicine is incredible at treating traumatic injury, especially, is what I think of. And there's what they can do in surgery and setting bones. It's really extraordinary. So basically, they're trading on that reputation for other things, going, well, because we're so good here, trust us in these other areas as well. And that's just not the case. Just because they're really good with traumatic injury doesn't mean they're great with health advice on how you should eat, or that they're opinions and advice and orthodoxy on vaccines hold through either. So I feel like that really provides the bastion of faith in medicine that people can see, of going, oh, wow, they are actually really good at this. And then people blindly assume that they're really good at other things too. But when we look into those other things, it's pretty clear that in a lot of other areas, they're not any good at all.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I'm speaking only from my experience. When I tried some natural remedies, it was tenfold stronger, or I don't know which rhetoric should I use here. But in my case, it was necessary to see the difference, to actually not be on the allopathic medical drugs, because it doesn't work altogether. But when you try something to heal naturally, it can be strong. But I'm not giving health advices, and I'm just speaking from my own perspective.
I think a lot of people have had that experience. And here we call it getting on the medical merry-go-round, right? Where they bring you in, they test you for something, they say it's a problem, they give you one drug, that drug causes side effects, then they give you another drug for that side effects. And it's unfortunate, but almost any of us, probably within the West in general, have seen people get on that medical merry-go-round and then spiral down. And you think, well, it almost certainly couldn't have been any worse, ultimately, what happened to them if they'd never started those medical procedures in the first place.
Yeah, definitely. And they're like, from my own perspective, like snake oil sales, like they used to be, they still are. And it's good that you wrote your essays, because I think in the one part, in essay number 1, you mentioned that you're actually trying to help them to be more honest and not to manipulate.
Yeah, I think so, because really it is the case, right? When humans just in general have a tendency to at least exaggerate a little or leave things out that don't support their story, and without people taking them to task on that and calling them out on it, then people just get into that more and more. Almost like fish stories, right? We all joke about people claiming they caught a fish way bigger than it really was, and all it takes to keep them honest is someone else who was there when it happened, right? And then they'll be a little more honest. So I think it probably does help them if we question them more, and forces them to be a little more realistic in what they tell us if they know we're going to question them.
Yeah, it's almost scary when you get to the point when they have like a media apparatus that helps them to enforce their discourse over and over again. And at the end, they would like to have robots nodding heads
Oh, yeah.
in front of TV, going to their shots every month or every week.
Yeah, just malleable people doing what they're told. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe let's go to the first part of your essays.
So in the first part of the essay, my focus, beyond giving people a general overview of what I was doing, was establishing the belief that I'm interrogating in this essay. So The essays focused on people's beliefs about historical mortality and vaccines, and specifically this belief that the reason we no longer see these really high levels of mortality that were common in the 19th century, especially in the early 20th, is because of vaccines. So the first thing I wanted to do is to establish why people believe that, who's saying that. And so I presented a lot of documentation on that. So the first part, I'm just giving people an overview, but then I get into, let me go ahead and jump to the area on this. I go ahead and get to the actual propaganda, which I divide up into different categories. So one of my favorite, I call the graveyard gambit, and it involves the speaker or the propagandist, I would call them a vaccine evangelist, pointing to old cemeteries full of tombstones, usually of fairly young children, and saying, see, that's what happened before we had vaccines, right? And so there's various examples. One of the first one is from a medical doctor and a pediatrician here in the States, Dr. Ari Brown. And this excerpt of hers, it's in her book, and public health here will take this excerpt and they'll put it in little pamphlets for doctors to give to parents who are vaccine hesitant, right? So we can read that right here of her saying, consider a bit of history. In the 1890s, people would have 7 or 8 children in their families, and only half of them would survive childhood. Just go to an old graveyard sometime and look at the ages listed on the headstones. Many of the diseases that killed those children are now prevented by vaccination. It's a fact. Vaccinations have increased the life expectancy of our nation's children. That's why our grandparents and parents embraced vaccine. Now, throughout the rest of this, it's just one example after another, really, of this, just to show how common it is and who's saying it. So again, we have like a Stanford immunologist making this exact same claim. Newspapers, reporters make a claim, and of course, vaccinologists or immunologists and vaccine developers such as Paul Offit make this claim. And so I just wanted to establish who's making the claim and where. Something that may have been a slight bit of an error on my part in the way I laid this out is a lot of people initially reading it could see no issue with this claim. Like they had no idea why I was making such a point of documenting this claim, because they didn't realize, of course, that it's so blatantly false. So I tried to explain that a little in the intro, but that does confuse some people as to why I go through so much trouble to document who's saying what. Shall we move on to some of the examples of why? Go ahead.
Yeah, please continue.
So basically what you see in those claims that we were just going over is, again, this idea that, okay, we aren't losing half our children now. The graveyards aren't full of little children's headstones, and that the reason why is because, well, we have vaccine. Now, if we actually look at the data, right, if we go in and graph it out, okay, so here's one of these graphs. This is the data for Belgium. We can see it goes back to 1851. The early data was probably underreported, which would explain this spike right here in about 1870. But still, we can see that the deaths from something like whooping cough in Belgium were an extraordinarily high number, something around 4,066 per year in the 80s. And then this precipitous decline, there's a gap in the data from World War I. And then they bring in the vaccine in 1959, by which time, obviously all the decline in whooping cough deaths has already occurred. And we can zoom in just a little closer into the same area past this data gap. So we'll just go to the past, starting in like the 20s. So this is the same chart, just a little closer. So you can see that by 1959, almost all the mortality decline has occurred. For something like measles in Belgium, it's the same thing, right? This precipitous decline, the vaccine doesn't come in until 1974. And then a little more widespread still in 1985, and all the deaths, the decline in mortality had occurred before they brought the vaccine in. So it can't be because of the vaccine that Belgium's no longer having these high mortality rates. And, it's the same for many other diseases. So we could look at something like scarlet fever in Belgium, right? There was no vaccine for it, but it declines to almost nothing anyways. And there's a close-up of scarlet fever. And then here's something like diphtheria in Belgium, right? By the time they bring the vaccine in, it's 1959, and almost all the decline in mortality has occurred. A particularly striking example would be whooping cough in Sweden, right? So here we can see we have the same thing, the steep decline. They don't bring the vaccine until 1953. Almost all the decline in deaths has already occurred. So the vaccine isn't the reason they're no longer having those high levels. In 1979, they abandoned the vaccination program. and effectively nothing happens. We can do a close-up here, right? This is 53 when they brought in the vaccine, 79 they abandon it. There's almost no deaths. There's one per year at most. They bring the vaccination program back in 96, and the deaths don't go lower still. They actually go up slightly. So we could see how it made almost no difference in Sweden whether they had a vaccination program going or not. That's cases, right? So people like pointing this out, that cases do go down in Sweden when they bring the vaccine in, even though deaths don't, but cases do. However, if you calculate the case fatality rate, you can see that there's something wrong here, right? Here in light blue, we have cases, and you can see that cases are much higher when there was no vaccine. And then a similar time period with the vaccine and cases go down. But if you calculate the case fatality rate, you see that the case fatality rate goes way up. And the most probable explanation for that is that why you would still have the same number of deaths but fewer cases is simply because they were reporting fewer cases. Measles in Sweden, we see something similar, right? This is a really extraordinary drop in deaths. They had around 2,000 deaths a year from measles in the 1860s. But by the late 1960s, it was around 2. So the deaths fell 1,000-fold. And we know that would have happened whether or not there was a vaccine. That drop, 1,000-fold decline in deaths would have occurred because it did happen without a vaccine, because they didn't bring the vaccine in until 1971. And that's generally the picture we get, that the later the vaccine comes in, the more the decline happens without the vaccine. So a country with some of the steepest declines is Italy, because they brought in the vaccine so late, right? So whooping cough, they didn't bring it in until 61, and almost nobody was getting it. So even by 85, it was only a fraction of children that were still getting the vaccine, but a near complete decline in deaths anyways. There's a close-up of that same data set. For measles, it's even a greater drop. Italy didn't bring the vaccine in until 1979. Right here, and you can see all the drop has happened by then. And even by 85, it was only 4 to 12% of Italian children were getting the measles vaccine. So most of them weren't getting it. Yet still that decline happened. And we'll go ahead and zoom in on this next graph so you can see that a little closer. Right. So now we're just looking from 1930 on, a close-up, whereas before we were looking at from 1887. So even by 1930, the greater part of the decline has happened. And then you can just see that it just keeps going down with no vaccine. They bring the vaccine in 1979, but almost nobody's getting it. It still just keeps going down. And by the 90s, when finally the vaccine uptake has increased and a lot of Italian children are getting it, the mortality decline is very nearly complete. Almost nobody's dying of it by then. A few, but very, very few measles deaths in Italy.
There's always a question if they didn't characterize the diseases. I don't know. Maybe that's conspiracy theory.
No, that's a valid consideration, right? That when you get down to the actual definition of a lot of these diseases, it becomes fuzzy. So
yeah,
a case in point actually here would be same thing. This is whooping cough cases in Sweden and the case fatality rate, which is the deaths divided by the number of recorded cases. And we can see that when they had no vaccine, there were a lot more recorded cases. Once they brought in a vaccine, there were few recorded cases here in dark blue. But the case fatality rate went up because there was actually no change in deaths. It was still about the same number dying. So then the question comes, why would that happen? Why would the case fatality rate skyrocket? And I think a fairly obvious answer is that they simply stopped calling the coughs that kids were having, they just stopped calling it pertussis. So then that would result in the cases plummeting. But if you have a really serious case, it still results in death. So then their case fatality rate skyrockets because they're just not reporting the cases anymore. So there is a lot of evidence of them doing that, right? Of saying the disease isn't there like whooping cough, right? But really whooping cough, if a child, it should be based on the clinical symptoms. But then later they changed the definition by saying, well, we have to test for Bordetella pertussis, and if we don't find that bacteria, then it's not whooping cough. But that's a new definition, so they can basically define a disease out of existence if they want to.
Yeah, I heard about the cases, people, even adults, coming to the doctor saying, maybe I have a whooping cough. And doctor said, no, you definitely don't have it because you're vaccinated. But then they to the blood test, and it was proven right. But maybe leave this here just like an assumption or maybe a conspiracy theory. The actual fact is undeniable fact is that decline was before the vaccines were introduced.
Yes, for sure. In the case of mortality, for sure, right? So again, that we can see this entire decline in deaths all the way down to the late 60s, by which time it's fallen 1,000-fold, and all of that's with no vaccine at all.
This was all after Second World War, more or less.
The vaccines for something like measles came in late, right, in the 60s. Some places like Ireland actually as late as like the 80s, by the time they were widespread. Other vaccines come in a lot earlier, like whooping cough. Here's whooping cough in New York City. They actually started experimenting with vaccines for it in the early 1910s, but not very successful. And then, they come into more widespread use, and eventually by 49, they're widespread. So that can be a little confusing for evaluating what the impact of the vaccine was. But one way around that is just to look at a country that introduced it really late. So, for example, Italy introduced whooping cough vaccines really late. So let's take a look at them. Right, so here's Italy, 1887 to 2003. You can see this incredible decline. They didn't even bring the whooping cough vaccine in until 1961, by which time almost all the deaths had stopped. So the mortality decline was almost complete. Even once they did bring it in, it wasn't part of their mandatory schedule. It was just optional. So most parents did not have their children vaccinated. As late as 85, they did a survey to see who was getting it, and it was only between 11 and 16%. So just a fraction of children were actually getting the vaccine, by which point the decline was almost 1,000-fold in whooping cough as well. So something like that, we could see, well, what would happen if you didn't bring it in until really late?
It's interesting how a lot of critical intellectuals who did acknowledge corona the tendencies, but they completely ignored the other vaccines.
Yes, yeah, that was really common, to basically assume that the other vaccines are great and wonderful, and then their criticism of the corona vaccine would be like, well, it's not a vaccine, as if that would have been a really good thing if it had been. And that is interesting that there wasn't as much of a spillover effect as what I thought there would be. I thought people would go back and question the other vaccines after they'd seen how much they'd been lied to about the most recent one.
Yeah, especially if we acknowledge that it's always the same story. First, they start to promote that they have to vaccinate 60% of population. And then when it's not working, they say we need 95%. And then side effects start to appear. And they say, it's not because of vaccine, it's because the people who don't vaccinate. This is like classic story.
It is. Yeah, kind of like smallpox. They start out saying, one shot, you're good for life. And then, well, maybe you need a booster shot of smallpox vaccine. And then eventually, well, maybe every year.
Yeah.
And then they still get epidemics. And yeah, well, think of how bad it would be if you hadn't had it.
Yeah. So also like to add that even if we stop the vaccination completely, or maybe in my opinion, anybody who wants to get vaccinated, let him or she have it. But if we stop, there would always be some flu and even deaths. And that's why it's always important to bring up the medical freedom conversation as well. Because even if something happens, we are still humans with basic human rights. And this is really important in the long run.
Mm-hmm. It is. And even for vaccines, right? If they are the right decision, then people will discover that on their own, right? Like you don't have to, anytime something's a really good idea, like let's say, I don't know, just drinking water often enough or something, you don't have to force people to do it because it's so obvious to them that they should do it. And so with vaccines, it's like if they were really this important and if we didn't have them, the consequences would be that strong, you wouldn't have to force anyone to do it. And usually I think they're saying basically they want to protect people from learning the hard way. But then that also means that if it's really not a good idea, people don't discover it, right? So with Sweden, they could have said, well, we don't want to let the vaccine go because think of how bad it will be. And then again, they did. And then we now know that it wasn't bad at all. It changed almost nothing.
Yeah, maybe it's a good timing to insert a religion component. It's interesting, like it was common acknowledgement that they're promoting corona supposedly virus on some propagandist, almost religious terms. But it's interesting how you precisely analyze it. And for me, for example, I was thinking, this some low vibrational word is propagandist. He's religiously defending corona, but I didn't even imagine that there are so many subtitles connected to the idea. And I think it's fascinating. In a couple of years, maybe everybody will be talking in these terms, but it's interesting how almost invisibly these ideas go into a world mainstream. Should I repeat again?
Oh, no, that's good. Yeah, no, it is, because it's like there's always a belief system. So something I went over in one essay it was a separate essay, but was just that people think we have freedom of religion, which technically we do, but religion is not the dominant belief system now, so it kind of doesn't matter. And amongst the dominant belief systems we do have would be something like the science. And that there you don't have a lot of freedom, because they go, well, this isn't a belief system, this is the truth. So within the series, if what I wanted to do was to break things down in some of those religious terms, just because the church already centuries ago broke down the positions of how people react to a belief system. And because the belief in vaccines is a similar belief system, you can use the same terminology. So I would look at someone who promotes the belief, promotes faith in vaccines as an evangelist. They're spreading the faith. Someone who undermines the faith, usually they initially believe in vaccines and then they don't, would be an apostate, right? They've rejected the faith and they're working against it. And then someone who defends against the apostate is an apologist. So that's why I had the basic breakdown. And same thing here, right, with certain analogies like bait and switch, right? Like you give someone one idea, and then when it actually comes to delivering it, you give them something slightly different and hope that they didn't notice. So I think I went over that, right? The bait is the idea that these vaccines are responsible for this drastic decline in deaths attributed to infectious disease. And that's what they sell you, right? But then if they're pushed on it, they switch to a claim like, oh no, it was more like notifications of incidents or something like that, and hope that you don't notice that they switched from mortality to notifications of incidents.
Yeah, and this is like vaccine evangelists versus vaccine apologists, right? Game.
Yeah.
Vaccine evangelists, they always they are the preachers of the faith, so to say,
Yeah,
right?
and so they'll make claims that are really hard to defend, actually that you can't defend. And then when those claims are debunked by, say, apostates, they don't defend their own claims. They just don't address it at all. And then another group will come along, who I call the apologists, usually like science bloggers. They'll come along and they'll defend them. And as part of that defense, they won't acknowledge what they were doing.
But apologists, in comparison with evangelists, are more aware. So apologists are more aware of the rhetorical tricks they are demonstrating.
Yeah, they have to know more, right? That the evangelist could be ignorant themselves. They themselves have been deceived and they think what they're saying is true. The apologists, to be effective, they have to already know that what the evangelist said wasn't true or was an exaggeration, and then they try to sideline.
And who are opponents of those two groups?
Yeah, so the opponent would be the apostate, right? Who once
the
believed
word I cannot pronounce.
Yeah, no, that's all right. It's not even really all that common of a word in English. Again, it's religious terminology, and I thought, well, this is a similar dynamic, so I might as well use the terminology that's already been developed to describe how people relate to a belief. Your evangelists promote the message, your apostates tear it down, and then your apologists come in to do damage control. And I see you've brought up here the Mott and Bailey, which is another
Yes.
analogy I gave. And all these analogies are describing the same thing. I just provided multiple analogies because a lot of times if one analogy doesn't click for someone, another will. So the Mott and Bailey is a really kind of visual idea, right, of a medieval defense system where you would have a motte, which in English is also called a keep, basically a castle. It's a stronghold. It's really hard to attack, but it's also small and it's cramped, and you'd rather not be there. You know, in the old castles, obviously not the luxurious new ones.
And evangelists are in the moat.
Well, so
No?
that's where they would retreat. So then the bailey in this system was basically the courtyard. And in the old system, the old European castles, that courtyard would just be surrounded by like a palisade, which would be like a wall of timbers essentially and a ditch. So it wasn't very easy to defend, but it was a large space. So the analogy, I believe it was Nicholas Shackle who came up with this analogy, and he was using it for other areas, but you see this all over the place, that they go out into the bailey, right? They want to occupy, rhetorically speaking, they want to occupy some really nice ground. And then when they're challenged, when their arguments are challenged, they retreat into the motte, and they retreat into different arguments. So the idea would be, in the case of vaccine, their bailey, the ground they want to occupy, is the belief that vaccines are what resulted in these dramatic mortality declines. When they're challenged on that, they can't defend it, so they go elsewhere. That's the equivalent of retreating back into the keep, into the stronghold. But they only go there for as long as they're attacked. And then they go back to preaching out in the bailey again and claiming the same things they just retreated from. So that's where they'll make these claims about vaccines being responsible for adding 30 years to our lifespan. They'll be challenged. They'll pretend they never made those claims in the first place for as long as they're arguing against a critic. And as soon as the critic goes away, their evangelists will go make those same claims.
It's really strong argumentation from your side, and I would like to know if there were any backlashes from some religious groups or pro-vaccination groups.
From the religious side, I got some criticism on some other essays I wrote, drawing the analogy between the belief in science and religious beliefs. And, you know, I think it was just people were a little oversensitive, right? Because Christianity's come under a lot of attack in the West in the last century or so. So I can understand them being a little oversensitive. And I wasn't drawing the analogy to pile on the criticism of Christians, who I'm not interested in criticizing them. And I have some admiration for some of the doctrines in Christian belief. I was just drawing the analogy just to help us see the continuity, right? That we'd exchanged one belief system for another. But as far as, let's say, the belief system serving as an excuse to impose your ritual upon someone, that we were in the same situation. So in the case of like the ancient Hebrews, right, you know, they had their belief system that you couldn't do any work on the Sabbath. And there's a verse in the Old Testament where a man is stoned to death because he was collecting firewood on the Sabbath. So basically, you know, using this belief system to enforce social conformity. And so I was drawing the analogy with vaccines, going, okay, vaccines are a ritual, right? You know, and I kind of mock it as calling it salvation through vaccination, or the doctrine of salvation through vaccination.
Were there any backlashes from vaccine critical groups? Because it's you have a strong and upfront argumentation, and there are people in my country who would say, "No, this is too strong. You have to be more nice and polite." I'm not implying that you are not. I'm just saying that in my area, strong argumentation is can be accepted as attack, which actually isn't, because it's just argumentation.
From the pro-vaccine side, among critics, you know, just like commentators, I've had people give various comments that, you know, they don't like this or that. None of it's been very serious. Most of them obviously haven't even read what they're criticizing.
I meant against vaccine critics, if they were if they made any backlashes.
Oh, like other vaccine critics saying this was too strong.
Yeah.
No, I haven't had any of that. A couple, like some of the people that I used the graphs of quite a bit, like like Greg Beatty, you know, he's from Australia and he graphed out a lot of the Australian data. He really liked the series. So I've gotten good feedback from other vaccine critics.
It should be good reaction, because I was just paralleling with my environment.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, did you left out any disease for which there is a vaccine?
Yeah, there's so many diseases and so many vaccines. I did narrow the scope. So the two major ones that I left out that I did not address in the series, one was smallpox because you can't. So basically what I'm doing with a lot of this is I was graphing out the data and looking at the trend as far as what was happening before a vaccine. And I was especially interested in seeing what would happen if you didn't have any vaccine at all, kind of like the Italian data when they brought in the vaccine so late that the whole decline had already happened. Smallpox is the first vaccine. And in many cases, the smallpox vaccine was in use before anyone was even keeping data on the deaths, right? The mortality data. So you can't assess the pre-vaccine trend by looking at the data, what was happening before the vaccine, because the vaccine's older than the data. So I left smallpox out. And the other one I left out was polio, because for one, it's not actually all that important in the total quantity of mortality, right? Like if you're wanting to see how much did vaccines contribute to the mortality decline, polio is almost irrelevant because it never killed anywhere near the numbers that the other diseases did. So I'm going to pull up a chart here just to show you relative mortality. One of the places I broke this down for was Spain. So let me go ahead and pull that up. Okay, so this chart here shows the number of deaths in the single deadliest year for each of these diseases in the 20th century in Spain. So flu obviously killed a massive number in 1918. Diarrheal diseases killed a lot too. Pneumonia, and again, bronchitis, tuberculosis, meningitis, even measles is up there. And then you get down to polio, right? Which again, it's not like to say it wasn't a major disease at the time, because by the time polio was hitting, the child mortality rate had already fallen really low. So it was a big deal for them, relatively speaking. But as far as answering the question of what role did vaccines play in the child mortality decline overall, as you can see here, it's just almost irrelevant. It just doesn't compare to the other diseases. So I left it to the side too, because it's a very complicated question and it doesn't track with the other diseases. And then the other diseases I could address as a group though, because they work as a group, right? Like something like diphtheria, measles, whooping cough, all of them, they're all very high at the same time and they all drop at almost the same time. So they cluster together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you took a long time to deconstruct Isabella B. This graphical proof that vaccine work. Maybe tell us more about that.
So the first part of the essay, right, I was just establishing what I called the evangelists, what they were saying. Then I showed what the apostates had disproved the evangelists. And then I looked at the apologists, the vaccine apologists who come in to defend the evangelists and defend the reputation of vaccines when these claims about historical mortality have been proven false. The most common thing they do is they'll switch the discussion to incidence data, right? So, there's mortality, which is death, and the data on that is recorded in many of these countries almost completely, right? On death certificates, and they collect up all the data and break it down by cause. And then there's also notifications data where doctors were supposed to, if they had a child who came in with like whooping cough or something, to report it. And so there's these notifications data. So what they'll do is they'll say, well, looking at death data doesn't tell us if the vaccine is effective or not. We need to look at notifications data, not how many people died, how many people got it. And there's a couple problems there, when they do this. So this is what I call a switch and a bait and switch. Is when they do that, they're switching the conversation, right? Because the conversation wasn't does the vaccine work? That's not the question. That's a separate question and it's a valid question. But when an evangelist, someone promoting vaccines, say vaccines are the reason we no longer have this high mortality rate among children, that's a mortality question. And it's a question about what vaccines did or did not do, not whether or not they work. So they'll constantly move to the question of whether or not vaccines work, which is a valid question. It's just you can't answer whether or not vaccines cause this mortality decline by asking whether or not they work. Or, what something did and what it can do are separate questions. So it's a fairly subtle rhetorical maneuver. And so I spent some time on it trying to make it really clear for people why you have to, think what you're asking. Are you asking what can this do or what did it do?
Yeah. And it's interesting, as I recall, a lot of authors directly cite this Isabella B. But do we actually know who this Isabella B is?
Yeah, so she's anonymous. I didn't really care that she was anonymous because she wasn't making any arguments from authority, right? So I figured, well, I can still evaluate the argument as either valid or invalid, even if we don't know who the author is, if they're using an anonymous name. So that didn't bother me too much. A lot of the other people defending vaccines, well, many of them actually are anonymous, and many of them aren't. So one example who's not would be David Gorski. He's a very prolific author, and he to his credit is not anonymous at all. Let me bring up his. Okay, his was part 5. I showed an example right here. Here's the breakdown, right? So here we have vaccine advocates when they're promoting vaccines. So I'd call this an evangelist. In short, because of vaccines, we live 30 years longer than we did 100 years ago, right? So Dr. Paul Offit makes that claim frequently. Then when someone like Dr. David Gorski comes along to defend vaccines from people who've debunked this claim, he'll say no one ever said that vaccination did account for the impressive declines in mortality seen in the first half of the 20th century. But obviously they did, right? So he's switching the conversation because he doesn't want to defend the claim that Dr. Offit made, and he doesn't want to admit that Dr. Offit made a claim that wasn't true. So his only option is just to switch the conversation to something else entirely. So that's what I'm talking about, right? That Dr. Offit's making a claim about what vaccines did or didn't do, and he's saying they did this. They added 30 years to our lifespan. And then someone like David Gorski will come along, doesn't want to defend that claim, so he tries to move the conversation to something else, like, do vaccines work? But even if a vaccine works, if it came after all the mortality declined, then it couldn't be responsible for that mortality decline.
Yeah, true. Okay, maybe now to move to the closing part of the interview. And maybe it's a good timing to share where viewers can find you and follow your work and support you.
Oh, yes. So I keep a Substack, and it's just called Jordan Substack, and I publish there occasionally. I also have a website, which is this website right here, Jordan Henderson Fine Art, and I upload my paintings there. And then, I also have prints of my work. So if people want some artwork on their walls, or even greeting cards or whatever, there's prints as well. And those are the websites where I publish things mostly, and I'll submit articles to other places as well, but usually after they publish, I'll republish, especially here on my Substack.
Okay, maybe now to address more general questions. For example, I would say that Corona opened the great division. In general, I would say like we are 50-50, pro and against. And maybe it's different in different parts of the world. But would you agree that this was actually great division of looking globally of the civilization or humanity?
I think it was. I think it was basically like a litmus test that allowed us to see who was willing to go along with things no matter how absurd they got, and who would sooner or later say this is absurd and not go along with it. So it sorted people out along those lines. Here in the United States, everything gets polarized between Republicans and Democrats, or right and left, right? So eventually it became kind of like a Republican thing to oppose COVID and a Democrat thing to go along with it. And so, yeah, it did polarize things for sure. But I would add almost like a third position with COVID, right? That there were those who believed that it was the pandemic it was claimed to be, and that the measures against it were justified. And then there were those who believed it was the pandemic it was claimed to be, more or less, but the measures weren't justified. And then there's a third group that goes, well, this looks kind of like it's a psyop, right? Like there actually wasn't a pandemic at all. You just took existing diseases, or through iatrogenesis, which is when you kill people through medicine itself, right? You're trying to save them, but you mess up and you end up killing them. That was really what COVID was about, right? That there were financial motivations as far as giving an excuse for a financial reset and moving large amounts of money into the monetary systems and so forth. So I feel like that's kind of a third position. And and that's a lot smaller, and it's been more or less overshadowed. Like as far as COVID opposition, it's been more or less overshadowed by kind of a mainstream, here in the US anyways, kind of like Republican position that doesn't really challenge the foundations of the story, just picks apart a couple little things here and there and probably claims that COVID came from a lab rather than, arising naturally from a bat or something.
It's actually not good that this question was like almost overtaken by left or right politicians. This is a more fundamental question that should be addressed outside of their regular media forums and circles and their satellites even. And do you think, if I can ask you, that now when Trump chose named Robert F. Kennedy for health secretary, I realized that he has some geopolitically critical statements. I'm not ignoring that, but at this moment I would like to focus on the medical perspective. Do you think that he will, when in office, that he will stick with his ideas?
Well, so there's a couple things that would have to happen first. One, he would, from what I understand, Congress would still have to approve it. Though I think even if Congress didn't, there's still a way Trump could put him in there anyways. So let's assume he gets in and RFK Jr. is in that position and he is overseeing these various health services in the United States. Whether or not he is sincere, I really don't know. I'm not sure. But even if he's not sincere, he would still have to at least keep up the pretense of being sincere. So he'd have to at least pretend to do something. And even just in pretending to do something, that usually involves something happening, right? This is what I think of with government a lot of times, right? Like, I think, okay, they're not being sincere. They're pretending to care. But even pretending to care actually does matter, because usually it means they have to do something. So like in the US, at least traditionally, they've had to pretend to care about free speech. Now, obviously, they don't, but they have to keep up the pretense that this is a free country. And part of that pretense involves that it actually is freer than some other countries in some ways. Like, I think free speech is in a much better position in the US than it would be in, say, like Germany or France. So even if he just pretends to do something, I think that will still lead to some actual positive results.
Would you say that he's more of a skeptic or he's like a full-blown heretic?
I don't know. He's definitely a politician, right? So with someone like Kennedy, I can't think of the exact examples now, but I think generally he'll tell his audience what his audience wants to hear. And most politicians are that way. So then it leaves everyone kind of guessing what they really believe, because you can't get what they believe just by asking them. So I suppose the only real test will be action, seeing what he really does once he's in that position. But on the whole, regardless of whether or not he's sincere, I think his getting in would be a good thing. And already it's a good sign that he's been elevated as far as he has, just because it's forced these kind of conversations into the public.
True. Okay, now we're moving to the closing question or questions. Two questions, I don't know.
Before we do, can I ask you one question?
Yeah, sure.
In Slovenia and the European Union, your environment over there, do you have any equivalent figure to Kennedy? You know, someone who's a very public figure who would be similarly outspoken against what happened during COVID or vaccines in general?
On that high profile level, I must say no, because we are more divided. Even if we are in Europe, there is no actual connection outside of a political structure. But now with Corona, there was a start of international connections. Maybe it will grow, but that kind of high level figure we don't have. Maybe it will come out of these groups, or more difficult, because he's also from a political family. We don't have anybody with that kind of legacy from the start. But critical movements here are very divided, especially in Slovenia. I don't know so much about other countries. We start doing something, and then there are 3 groups, and then we all argue at the end. And I more or less removed myself out of that sphere, because till now, some good ideas had some effect, but you cannot actually do anything with this. For example, I'm a journalist. I expose some important topics for my area, but this is like treated like a work for fun and stuff like this. I really maybe viewers will support also my work, so I can get out of Slovenia at least for a travel or something like that. So you have other question?
That was the main one I had, just what the environment looked like from that side, because at least my impression here from the United States is that the US exerts a tremendous amount of control over the way Europe goes as well. Like if the US goes a certain way, there's at least a tendency for Europe to follow. I've only traveling outside of the US, I've only done in Latin America, but it hit me there how much everyone focuses on what happens here. Like they were at least as interested in our presidential elections as we were, maybe even more so, and really concerned about all of it because the US at least was projecting so much power into these other areas. So I just wasn't sure if Europe had a little bit of a, I mean, obviously the environment's a little different, but I wasn't sure if it was mostly still just kind of what was happening here as far as what RFK Jr. was doing was still higher on the medical freedom profile in Europe than a figure there so far.
It is, and it's also in the mainstream media of yours. It's not in Europe. It's not. It's, for example, Rainer Fulmich, the attorney who has spoken against corona policy, is now under arrest. He's in prison for more than a year, and there is no breakthrough till now, maybe later. But yes, European politics follows states and other, let's say, corporations, and it's pretty suicidal concerning geopolitical situation. And maybe if I continue from this point further, if, for example, what do you think these medical freedom issues will develop further? Because maybe if the West doesn't self-destruct in the war or wars, maybe it's a perfect geopolitical area to enforce some technocratic utopia, because we have high technology and more or less chaotic politics. And if I were a globalist, I would say, yeah, let's make Europe or some islands geographical area. I don't mean geographically, but geopolitically. Let's make this like an island with high technocracy, and we will have some mainstream media there, and we will block all other information. And yeah, I think that can be the idea behind the happening. What's your take on this?
I think they did use something like COVID to advance that goal, and that they were able to put a lot of things into place. I think they would have a really hard time doing the same thing again, right? Using COVID all over again, because it made so many people skeptical. Again, again here looking at like the Republicans, that they weren't skeptical at first, and then after about a year, they did become skeptical. So if they were to try to do it again, I think they'd have a much harder time pushing it through. So now maybe there'll be something else that will be more useful to them. Maybe war, maybe something else entirely. But I do think that something like vaccines is still important, really, as far as educating the public, because once you wake people up to something, once you get them into the habit of questioning and thinking carefully about things and asking how people know, what they claim to tell them, what's the evidence, then it starts to spread to other things. So I feel like there's a lot of, as far as people's misguided faith, it's like a tapestry, and you just need to start pulling on some thread, and then maybe you can unravel the whole thing. And to me, something like vaccines are kind of a big deal from that, because in a lot of things, you can come to a decision that something's wrong, and then there's not much you can do about it in your day-to-day life, right? Like, let's say something like 9/11. A lot of us in the US have come to be very skeptical of that, but there's very little you could actually do to be like a wrench in the gears or to somehow stop it. But with something like vaccines, it affects you personally, because you're making that decision. You could take this information and then decide, well, I'm not going to take that vaccine, or I'm not going to get my kid vaccinated. So there's an immediate potential benefit to people themselves based on the information around this. So So even though I don't think we're going to see another COVID soon, I mean, I could be wrong. I'm not a prophet. It just seems like it'd be hard for them to pull it off again. I think this is.
How
Go ahead.
about World Health Organization pandemic treaty? Because with that in their pockets, they could actually enforce totalitarian state in 5 minutes if that passes.
Yes.
That contract or pact. Or...
Yeah, they have legally what they need, right? I guess I'm thinking of it from the standpoint of something like COVID required everyone going along with it, right? Like something like the masks. That's what made it look like a pandemic, because everyone was wearing a mask. Otherwise, it wouldn't have looked like a pandemic at all. So they needed everyone to do that. And if enough people had just said no right then, they couldn't have pulled it off. So I guess, again, it wouldn't surprise me if they try again, like maybe with bird flu. That would be a possibility they could use. But I think it would be a lot harder for them now, just because they made so many people so suspicious the last time they did it. But again, I could be wrong. Maybe they'll pull it off again. And maybe that's even the point of having some officials that the dissidents trust a little more, having like a Trump administration, because a lot of COVID dissidents like Trump, and putting RFK Jr. in there, and maybe like Robert Malone. Maybe that's the point. Maybe that's a long game to put officials in there that the dissidents trust. And then if they pulled this off again, maybe they'd have a little of a better chance. So I don't know. I can see multiple possibilities there for sure.
Okay, and the last question was, what can people do to keep freedom also in the medical field? But I think that you mostly answer it just before. Do you have any thoughts for the ending, for the conclusion?
No, I think that's a good question to end on, right? So a lot of us, we have no personal authority overseeing anything, right? It's mostly just what we can do is we can make decisions for ourselves, and we can educate other people. And so with a lot of things, people will say that, okay, well, what are you going to do? How are we going to change things? And I think they want to hear an answer almost like a revolution or whatever. But I feel like in any case, the more people who see a problem clearly, the more chance that we'll have of answering that problem. Or when there is a possibility to act in some beneficial way, more people will do it, right? So like, using COVID as a case example again, if more people had already been thinking critically about vaccines and medicine, then a lot more people would have refused to do something like wear a mask, and they could have basically brought the thing to a halt immediately. So I feel like that's the most important thing, is just knowing, learning enough to have one's own opinions on this and get to the truth of various matters. And then if you can, where you can, bringing other people along, helping them see the light on that too. And then the next time something like this happens, hopefully it'll go, better for us, for the common people, if more of us understand what's happening.
Thank you. And I think this conversation opens a lot of questions, a lot of important data, and a lot of important ideas, actually.
Thank you for having me.